So thank you very much, and it's a great pleasure to be here and to see so many people here. Over the next 45 minutes to an hour, you may detect a slight Welsh accent. And that Welsh accent has got a lot stronger during the Six Nations. So that's the only comment I'm going to make about rugby. What I'd like to do this evening is to give you a brief introduction to global food and nutrition security and the role of innovation. But I also want to, first of all, just say how much I enjoyed meeting with the masterclass this afternoon. And I think the key point that I want to get across that we communicated this afternoon was this is a great time to be involved in science and technology. And I hope that is one of the underpinning themes that I can communicate and share with you this evening. Some of you may recognize this individual here. His name is Sidney Brenner, a Nobel laureate, and he died earlier this month in Singapore. He's one of my scientific heroes, and I want to explain briefly why that is. I had the pleasure of engaging with Sidney when I was learning essentially genomics at the DuPont company in the 1990s as a Fulbright scholar. But Sidney was one of those individuals that not only developed and deciphered the genetic code, but went on to develop a completely new system, C. elegans, that supported the development of cell development and also understanding of brain development. I guess there were two things. If you haven't read this book, it's worth getting hold of, actually, My Life in Science, because he says two things. One is he emphasizes the pursuit of ignorance. What he means by this is that when you know so much about something, it's time to change fields. And that is something, again, that became apparent in the masterclass this afternoon. But the other thing that became apparent and is in this book, we often ask the question, which science should we fund? And it's quite simple. All science is problem-driven and should be judged by the importance of the problem and the quality of the solutions provided. And tonight, what I want to present is one of the biggest challenges we face, and that is food security, increasing production by more than 70% without destroying the environment. Interestingly, that child there is eating sweet potato, but that child is also eating a yellow flesh sweet potato. I had the privilege of working within the CGIR as a chief scientist for 3 years, and that is an intervention, a simple intervention of changing the flesh color of sweet potato that increases access to vitamin A. So a rather simple example, but a pivotal example of where changes can increase not only food production, but also the nutrition available to people around the world. The second personal example I want to refer to is the Arab Spring. And my daughter, who studied Arabic, lived in Cairo during the Arab Spring, and that's where 2 of my grandchildren were born. And one of the key messages that I got from Rumen was the absolute pivotal importance of bread to Egyptians. The Arabic word for bread is aish, which means life. And it accounts for a significant amount of calorific intake in the Egyptian population. Now, during the Arab Spring, the price of bread went up 37%. And therefore, the connection between peace and access to food is absolutely critical. And this is what we see. In fact, what you see in the bottom left-hand corner there is the famous bread helmet. So the point that I'm making here is that although we'll discuss food and nutrition security and technology and science, fundamentally, this is about people. Indeed, if we look at the data and the relationship between food insecurity and civil unrest, you see a very, very strong relation between the food price index and the occurrence of civil unrest across the Arab states, ranging from 2008 until 2012. Now, it's kind of ironic that we would have food riots in Egypt, because Egypt and the associated countries around Egypt, the so-called Fertile Crescent, is where domestication of many crops and ruminants took place. So this is where, in fact, much of my own personal research has been conducted, and that is looking at the evolution and domestication of crop plants. What you see on the left-hand side of this panel is the history of the formation of wheat, which is an alloexaploid. It's made up of 3 different genomes that have come together over 16,000 years of evolution and domestication. So much of my research has been involved in unraveling those processes, those mechanisms that create a new crop. On the right-hand side is a panel which is showing, following on from my own work in NIAB in Cambridge, how my colleagues have been using that information to resynthesize wheat and produce new wheat cultivars that increase productivity by 20 to 30%. So it's kind of ironic in the sense that we have, on the one hand, we see centers of domestication and evolution where crops evolved, yet now in Egypt, 50% of the calories are imported. And if we look more generally at the evolution and domestication of crops, there's a disconnect, as shown in this slide here, between regions of the world, the so-called Vavilos centers of domestication, where those early civilizations domesticated crops and certain species of livestock, and now where we have productive agriculture. So there's kind of a story here about where crops evolved and now where we see the most productive agriculture. Another interesting feature of that sweet potato that that child is consuming is, in fact, it's a naturally transgenic crop. A paper in PNAS 4 years ago showed the occurrence of parts of the agrobacterium molecule located within 291 sweet potatoes. So in other words, our understanding of food genomes is accelerating at great pace. Now let's talk a little bit about global hunger index. This is rather a detailed slide. It's published relatively recently, 2018, which shows a multifactorial picture of hunger globally, regionally, and nationally. And what you can see on the right-hand side of the slide and the graph is most of the countries affected are in sub-Saharan Africa, and in fact, the Central African Republic in particular is exhibiting considerable levels of hunger. There are a number of metrics which are used to measure hunger, but what we see, they are 4: child mortality, wasting in children, stunting in children, and proportion of undernourished. But despite the gloom, progress has been made in terms of alleviating hunger. The other feature which is important when we talk about food and nutrition security is that we cannot divorce this from migration. So the areas where there are maximum places of hunger and food insecurity are also the regions where we have conflict, political violence, and population displacement. So really what we are saying here is that many of the challenges that we are considering are complex in nature. And in fact, that is why we have the Sustainable Development Goals, which are a global expression of sustainability, represented by 17 specific goals. However, these goals, the SDGs, are integrated. They are not independent. They are interdependent. And you can see this by looking at the slide in front of you here, where we look at the SDG 2 of zero hunger. That is interconnected to a number of other metrics. So, what does this mean? This is a slide from David King, who was the chief government scientist a number of years ago, who identified the 21st century challenges, and working from 12 o'clock at the top of food production right through to climate change, what you can see is that these are interconnected, but population and population demographics are at the heart of many of these interconnected issues. Now, I don't have time to go through all of these this evening. What I want to do is to get across the fact that we're dealing with complexity and identify the key major strategic drivers, and then the science and technology that might be available to start addressing some of these big issues. First, in terms of population growth, yes, we know that populations are expanding, and yes, we know that based on these models, which have quite a high variance associated with them, we may have up to 10 billion people. But what is also clear from this slide is that population growth is slowing down. And one of the reasons for this population growth slowing down, apart from 1 or 2 pockets, is in fact the number of females in full-time education. So that we're at a pinnacle, we're at an interesting point in terms of population demographics at the moment, in terms of being able to match potentially productivity, but also with environmental sustainability. Of course, these simple population graphs also tell us differences between what's happening in Western Europe and also comparing it to Africa, where in Africa we have a much, much younger population. In fact, 50% of the population at the moment is under the age of 25. This is important for a number of reasons. The other factor that is important is the growing urban population, where now we have more people living in cities than we have living in the countryside, and also the projections are that this will increase to over 6 billion people by 2050, and most of this will take place in Africa and Asia. This has a number of implications for the nutrition of people living in cities. Because when people move into cities, the pattern of food consumption changes dramatically. So it changes in the sense that we now have to think much, much more about the accessibility, affordability, and the nutrition available to people. So just to summarize the first part of what I want to say, in many ways, the early part of the 21st century is already determined. We have considerable demographic momentum, we have considerable urbanization, and we have climate change taking place as well. Following on from that, people are getting wealthier, so the major challenge that we are going to face now is nourishing the future cities of the world. And global food security, which we've largely considered as a rural issue, is going to become much more of an urban challenge. And therefore, access to this food and the nutrition embedded within that food is going to become even more important. I want to talk now over the next few slides about some data that was produced by my colleagues in the CGIAR a few years ago in PNAS, pointing out that the global diets are becoming much, much more similar, becoming much more, the homogeneity of food supplies is increasing. This is manifest in this slide here. On the left-hand side, it shows the trends that have been taking place over 50 years, where we have a much more concentrated diet, and on the right-hand side, changes in the consumption of various types of food. So an increase in oil-dense crops, soybean, sunflower, and palm oil, and a decrease in the consumption of what would be considered the staple crops of the world. This, of course, is associated, is correlative, but to what people call the double burden of malnutrition, where we have approximately similar numbers of people who are obese and also those which are undernourished. And this is a global phenomenon which is taking place right across the world. This, and certainly as major economic costs and social costs, where we see now obesity increasing in significance and falling just behind smoking and violence in terms of its global significance. If we then pause and we look at what we should be eating in terms of the Harvard Healthy Eating Plate model and compare that to what we're actually producing, there's a disequilibrium. So what we see in many ways is an overproduction of cereals and an less consumption of fruit and vegetables and other food that we should be consuming. So what is happening is that we have an increase in the consumption of starchy crops, maize, sugar, soybean, and oil palm. But more importantly, if we look at this question here of the changes that are taking place, it is interesting to reflect on why that might be. So this is some work that a colleague of mine, Ian Dawson, has been doing, is that he's been looking at the production systems of what are called the 5 winner crops, and those are the 5 crops that have been consumed greater, such as oil palm, rice, soybean, sunflower, and wheat, are compared to the loser crops. And what you see in the top panel is that you generally are seeing an increase in the productivity of those crops and/or an increase in the land utilization. Whereas the loser crops, we are not seeing those same productivity increases. Now, what is interesting is you can also look at this data in another way. In this case here, considering this slide, on the y-axis, we're looking at biodiversity and the production systems. So if you move from the left-hand side of the panel to the right-hand side of the panel, what you see at the right-hand side are those crops which are the winners but are grown almost exclusively as monoculture. Whereas those crops to the left-hand side, including the so-called losers, are the ones which are grown under mixed farming systems, which are the farming systems which predominate in smallholder farming. So the real question about this is, why is it that we're investing so much money in those crops which are grown in monoculture versus those crops which are grown in mixed farming systems and are also so important for diet and health globally? So there's a disconnect there. In addition, if we want to preserve biodiversity, we need to be thinking about future farming systems and how we're going to enhance some of the crops which have become left behind in some of the analysis that I've just described. So the patterns of food consumption are also of considerable public interest. There's the outcome of the publication in the Lancet and others which are pointing to the need to have much healthier diets, and also concern particularly with respect to meat consumption and the environment. And this is a little article that appeared in The Guardian, which again implies that meat consumption, livestock farming, is a major contributor to destroying the environment. This, of course, represents major cultural clashes, including veganism and other examples of in some cases, pet owners keen to feed their animals a vegan diet. However, if I was to ask people in this room, how many of you smoke? How many of you put your hand up? How many smokers are there? One. If we posed that same question 50, 60 years ago, the room would contain 60, 70 people smoking. So this issue we cannot be complacent about. The changes in public attitudes to smoking and indeed to the consumption of meat is an important issue. One of the best responses to the Eat Lancet report is actually from the Minister of Agriculture for Ethiopia. And I'll just take a moment just to read the key elements of this. And this is referring to the Eat report. It reflects a tendency I often see when discussing Ethiopia's livestock ambitions with European or American colleagues, a view of livestock that ranges from the ambivalent to sharply negative. It thus misses an important opportunity to contextualize the diverse food production systems that characterize much of the world outside the rich, developed countries. Therefore, looking at ways in which we can maximize diversity in farming systems and in diets is an important element of the future trajectory that we must pursue. Again, just to take a look at this, if we take this as an example of a smallholder farmer in northern Kenya, Ethiopia, what do we see? We see mixed farming. We see livestock. We see agroforestry. We see corn being grown in the background, which is outbred, not hybrid. We see a woman with a baby. The first 5 years of that child's development will be absolutely critical, and therefore access to nutrient-dense food, including iron and vitamins, including milk, and protein derived from meat, will be critical. We also have a woman who will be doing much of the work on this farming system. So that is the context in which agriculture in the developing world needs to be considered. It's also, livestock, absolutely vital to at least 8 of the Sustainable Development Goals. And that is why, within Edinburgh, we have a major focus, the Centre for Tropical Livestock and Centre for Tropical Livestock Genetics and Health, a Gates-funded program to look at science-based opportunities for small-scale farmers in sub-Saharan Africa. The focus of this is exploiting and using the diversity across the ecology of Africa. This diversity will have generated many mutations over millennia that we will see in the livestock and in the plants that are grown in Africa. So harnessing this variation is an opportunity which requires the application of modern science and technology. In fact, just a couple of examples here of the rich biodiversity that we see. in terms of different types of cattle adapted to different forage, meat with low cholesterol, and also new products that can be derived from livestock as well. So harnessing this diversity is a real need and a real opportunity. So we should be looking at this, and livestock in particular, as part of an agri-food circular economy, where we need to certainly balance production and consumption, but also looking at the opportunities that exist for food integrity through new technologies as well. It doesn't, of course, it isn't restricted to livestock. It also applies to plants. In fact, 80% of the plant food consumed can be traced back to 12 crops. Yet there are many, many more species in Africa and other parts of the world that are important parts of diet. Now, that is why we have an initiative working with the African orphan crops in Nairobi to explore some of the diversity in many of these African species as well, which have not been exploited or not been improved to a great extent. So, to pause here and to bring this part of what I want to say to a close is that diverse food systems are really important in terms of generating healthy diets. Now, what I want to do in the next part of the presentation is to focus on some of the innovation and some of the science and technology. But if we look at where we are today and to where we need to be in 2030, there are a number of technological developments that are going to be important as we move towards 2030. I don't have time to be able to delve into all of them, but what I do want to identify are the key strategic drivers. As I've already said, hyperurbanization and rapid changes in diet are one. The second, which is particularly important to us in Scotland and I think here in Ireland, is balancing global trade systems with regional trade systems, with local trading systems. And of course, the culture of innovation. This is a slide I've taken from George Bennington. And this really would look at the state of the world in 1950, where we had little knowledge of DNA, no widespread use of antibiotics, little scientific coordination for scientific research, no space travel, no satellites, and no contraceptive pill. So in our lifetime, science and technology has changed dramatically. And this should be a cause for optimism. Indeed, if we look at science at the moment, there are a number of key things that emerge. One is much of the science that we're dealing with is challenge-led. Whether we look at here in terms of the gut microbiome, whether we're looking at supply chains, or if we're looking at disease prevention. It requires interdisciplinary approaches, but it also requires collaboration. And much of this collaboration requires international collaboration and a global outlook. So these are key features of future scientific endeavor. Certainly, as well, within the UK, though, we see a major change taking place with the formation of UKRI. And that is the opportunity to connect scientific excellence and with an uncompromising focus and excellence to impact through focus on grand challenges. But another major development is that we no longer have funders, but we have investors who are investing against economic and social benefits. As far as the culture of innovation and disruptive technologies are concerned, this is obviously a very expanding, a very dynamic area, a very dynamic ecosystem. What I want to point out tonight is that if we look on the left-hand side and we look at information technology, we're moving from a situation where there's been some confusion to one where there is cognitive computing, the application of artificial intelligence to a number of different areas. We also have the developments of a circular economy where we want to maximize the utilization of natural resources, and then the whole area of editing of crops, of livestock and humans, and the availability of cheap real-time sequencing. One of the issues around availability of food is the disequilibrium where we see population growth and the availability of land. What that means is that there will be movement of food to trade, and therefore the resilience of food supply chains become a massive issue. And one of the areas that I think is becoming more and more important is something that has emerged from the banking sector, the finance sector, and that is the distributed ledger technology or blockchain technology to support provenance and traceability in the supply chains, but also improve transaction speeds and efficiencies. And I think these are opportunities, again, to support resilience within our various food systems and an area that we're exploring. I just want to spend a few minutes on genetics. Many of you in this room will know more about genetics than possibly I do, but all I want to emphasize in this slide here is the fact that we need to be able to use genetics to develop multiple wins. What I'm simply showing in this slide here are two examples of changes between the small dog on the left-hand side and the large dog. Can't remember what they're called, but the dogs exhibit a massive variance in body weight, and those changes can be explained by one or two genetic factors, particularly the insulin growth factor. In terms of the panel on the right-hand side, what we have is corn, cultivated corn on the right-hand side. On the left-hand side is wild relative teosinte, and most of the changes between teosinte and cultivated maize can be explained by a small number of genes, particularly those involved in cytokinin metabolism. So genetics is a very, very powerful tool. A very good example of the application of genetics, non-GM genetics, by my colleagues in the CGIR, in the International Rice Research Institute, and collaborators in Japan, is the identification of a gene that is responsible for rapid internode expansion. This is an escape mechanism. The biology behind this is fascinating in that it involves hormonal recognition. It involves the isolation of key genes involved in gibberellin metabolism. But what this has done is allowed the development of rice plants that respond rapidly to flooding. The so-called submergent-tolerant rice, which now is reaching 11 million hectares of flood-prone land in Asia. It's a fantastic example of the application of genetics and breeding to develop a step change in the growing of rice. Not only does this influence and shape productivity, but it also enables these farmers to build resilience into their financial system, to be able to borrow money and therefore to educate children. So it's a really neat example of the application of breeding technology. Another example is the development of bean varieties, which are not only tolerant to increases in temperature, which affect pollination at night, but also increasing the iron content of beans. This is work that's been done at CIAT in Latin America, showing how, again, breeding can be used to develop multiple wins. And lastly, an example from the crop world is how we can potentially change the patterns of photosynthesis from C3, which we mostly find in temperate crops, to C4 photosynthesis, which is much, much more efficient. So the sort of photosynthesis we see in corn. And this has the potential, again, to deliver step change in terms of productivity. More work to be done here. It's a complex problem, but much work is going on in this area as well. Let us not forget, though, the productivity gap. And the productivity gap between African maize and US maize, which is shown in this slide here. So that we have major issues around productivity between the developed and the developing world. Well, one of the technologies which I know many of you in this room are familiar with and deploying is the application of genomic selection. And for the first time in the history of agriculture, we have the potential to decouple selection from phenotyping, using algorithms which will allow to predict desirable recombinant genotypes without phenotyping. It doesn't mean that phenotyping isn't important, but this gives an opportunity to really accelerate the pace and rate of genetic gain. One example of that is from my own organization, which won the Queen's Anniversary Prize in 2017 for the application of genomic selection in dairy genetics, making considerable progress in the rate of genetic gain in dairy. But the important thing about this as well, going back to multiple wins, is that by increasing the productivity, you reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So it's a classic example of being able to use genetics to deliver multiple benefits. Now, I know Jerry is in the audience here, and I've just taken this slide from the Technology Foresight program that Jerry and colleagues produced, focusing on microbiota. And of course, the microbiota are important in soils, they're important in human gut, but they're also important in ruminants. And this is another example of work from my own organization in terms of looking at the Rumen Microbiome by two of my colleagues, Rainer and Mike Coffey. who've been looking at the microbiome of rumen, using both a genetic and a metagenomic approach to identify those microbes within the rumen that are influencing emissions from cattle. What Brenner was able to do, this is a paper that appeared in PLOS Genetics, was identify a subset of those microbial genes that explain a significant amount of the variation associated with methane emissions. So this is now an opportunity to be quite disruptive. By taking sampling rumen from the abattoir of live animals, you can then start developing predictive equations that can improve not only methane emissions, but also feed efficiency, and potentially as well looking at animal health and animal welfare issues. So this is where I think some of the disruptions can make a real benefit and a real contribution to food and nutrition security, not only within the UK, but globally as well. Finally, there is a massive need for us to be looking at alternative sources of protein. And one of the areas that we've been exploring is the development of insect-derived protein, which will of course, again, make use of waste and the potential of generating novel source of protein for feed in livestock and aquaculture. And we've been teaming up with a new startup company called Beta Bugs to apply some of the technology I've just been describing to actually insect breeding to see if we can accelerate the development of soldier flies for increasing protein availability for livestock and aquaculture. I want to close by a couple of examples from genome editing, and in terms of the masterclass this afternoon, I know that a number of our young scientists are involved in this here, but genome editing is a technology that allows us to change the genomes of humans, livestock, and crops. What is interesting about genome editing is actually the fact that it was discovered in the food sector. Much of the primary discoveries were made in Europe, but the application and the translation of that is taking place in North America. So one example coming from the Roslin Institute is the development of pigs which are resistant to African swine fever. An example here of using exotic variation to be able to identify key mutations responsible for this particular resistance, and then editing the genomes of domesticated pig to confer that resistance. The second is the example of dehorning in cattle and the Powell allele, where this allele has been changed. I think it's a duplication within the allele of that particular gene, which produces cattle without horns. And this, of course, gets over one of the major animal welfare issues that we're facing. So, this technology is available. This is also available in and is being deployed in crops, particularly by DuPont Pioneer, who are formed a strategic alliance with Caribou Biosciences. And we will see going forward, certainly in the private sector, the development of seed of wheat, soybean with enhanced resistance, increases in nutritional content, and drought tolerance by the application of this technology. The question is whether we're going to see this in Europe. And this raises one of the major issues that I think we face going forward within Europe, within the UK, and I'm not sure what the situation is in Ireland, but is the acceptance of technology and the utilization of that technology. This is a cartoon which is far too detailed to describe in detail, but it was part of an outcome of a series of meetings that I held with DuPont in my previous role. And one of the key issues that emerged from that was really being able to communicate public good. What is the benefit of the research that has been conducted, and being able to communicate in that in a way that connects with members of the public and taxpayers? So we have a real responsibility and need to demonstrate the economic and social impact of our research. There are massive opportunities now for us to identify global challenges that are tractable through research. We need to be growing our capability, driving culture change, but also looking at interdisciplinary opportunities and identifying pathways to impact that expand to the developed world. In other words, what I'm saying is the challenges that we face within Ireland and with the UK are very similar to those that are faced in the developing world. Identifying those opportunities and working collaboratively to address them is going to be important. I deliberately am not going to talk about Brexit, but one of the other roles that I have is that I convene University of Scotland Research and Knowledge Exchange Committee. And one of the real issues that we're seeing at the moment is that we are living within a very divided society. And therefore, access to opportunities, the generational divide, values, what is taking place centralized versus decentralized are massive issues. And I think there's a real important role for academies such as your own here in Ireland to play a really important role in being able to communicate the importance of science and technology in addressing global challenges. So I'll conclude now by saying that there's an opportunity and in fact a need for unprecedented levels of strategic collaboration. And this collaboration is needed to create the step changes that we need to address the global challenges, but to accelerate the rate at which we deliver the impact of research on a global scale. So thank you very much for the invitation to be here. It's been a great pleasure to be here. The other area that I haven't touched on is the importance, though, of connecting to policy. Because the way in which we connect the evidence base to policy is going to be critical. I think last year there was a paper in Nature where the government chief scientists from the UK, from the various departments, published an article on the importance of evidence synthesis. And they identified 3 or 4 areas. One of them was the rigor with which evidence is generated. 2 is the inclusivity of that. 3rd is the transparency of that information. And 3rd, making sure that that's accessible. So I think the connections and the synthesis of evidence is also going to be absolutely critical in order for us to be deliver on the innovation we need to tackle the global challenges that we face in society. Thank you very much for listening.